Hey guys, welcome back to Post Series. Today we're going to dive into fluid morphs. Many of you requested this demo, so we'll finally jump into it. If you're not familiar, a fluid morph is actually when the client cuts out a chunk of frames. It's also known as a jump cut. So you'll have a plate and then the client might not like certain movement that the actor or actress is making, and they want to cut those frames out of the shot completely, but they do want to use the rest of the frames from the shot. So usually it's called a jump cut. So you'll cut from one frame. Let's say you'll cut from frame 50, but frame 51 will actually end up being frame 100 because if they wanted to take out 50 frames. So that's just an example. Usually it's 10, 15, 20 frames. Sometimes there are multiple fluid morphs within the same shot. And it's very important when you're doing fluid morphs, you need to make sure that when you're morphing, you're actually matching to your edit ref, because you need your morph to match with the sound that's going to be added to your shot, whatever the actors on the screen are talking about. You need their lips to be in sync, or their body language to be in sync with what's going to happen once the sound is added. So you really have to try to do these morphs in a way that they match the edit reference that you're given, because that edit ref is taking into consideration the sound being added on top. So let's jump into this. I actually created this gizmo. It's similar to a gizmo that I used before called the Morph Blend, and it's just a little bit dialed in specifically to give some good results for fluid morphs in particular. Let's take a look at some of the settings. So for this shot, I did, so if let's just start from the beginning. So usually you'll have a plate. So this is our plate, and the client will give you a frame range where they want to cut out frames. So you will need to offset your plate to account for that gap in frames. And so I offset my plate by -57, and I'm using that as the point where I'm going to morph. And usually the client will also give you a frame range. Although it might not be exact, you'll be able to find that range by looking at your, by comparing your plate to your edit ref. For this example, we'll just say that the fluid morph is going to happen between frames 88 and 100. And so we'll go to frame 88. And then at frame 88, we want our plates or our fluid morph to match the actual plate. But when we switch to frame 89, that's when we want the morph to start happening to account for those 57 frames that we're cutting out. So for this fluid morph tool, you have a keyframe for your fluid morph, and to switch between the two plates, you can keyframe between 0 and 1. So we have an input called 0 and we have an input called 1, so that we can see which keyframes we want to set. Now at frame 88, if we want frame 88 to match our plate before any type of jump cut, we will keyframe this to 0. And then we don't really know how many frames we need to morph this out before it starts matching the edit ref. Of course, I don't have an edit ref because, I'm just using some footage that I have. But I decided on my own to end my morph at frame 104. I usually find with this tool that a 5 to 10 frame range, maybe a little more, a little less, is a pretty good place to start. Now, once you start playing this and watching your fluid morph, which we're going to talk about some things that you should definitely watch out for when you're doing these fluid morphs, we might adjust these frame ranges. So at frame 104, we now want to be fully onto our morphed plate. So we will go ahead and at frame 104, we'll keyframe our fluid morph to 1. So you don't necessarily need to go through this and start keyframing a bunch of frames. You just need to keyframe frame 0 and then frame 1. So once we have that set, I'll show you the movement that we're going to cut out. So we have this actress here. Let's watch her play. And we'll say, you know, she's kind of like smiling and smirking, but there's a point in this plate where she begins to move her head and kind of smile a little bit. So we'll just say, pretend like we want to, like the client came back to us and they said, hey, we don't really like when she's making that movement. Let's cut that out. So we'll see that that's going to start around frame 88. Here, when she starts smiling and she starts moving her head a little bit and blinking her eyes, we don't really want to use all that. We just want her to be kind of smirking the whole time. So what we'll do, we set our keyframes. Let's take a look. Now, once you set your keyframes, you do also want to select your morph type. And before, you could key this, the fluid morph before or after. I have some steps here, which even I am not following right now. But ideally, you can follow these steps to help you get started with this gizmo. So you select your morph type. If you're familiar with retimes, we have Chronos and O-Flow, which are two pretty good retimes. And Chronos specifically is really good for motion retiming. Both of them, if your method is using the frame setting, then they'll both do pretty much the same thing. But I usually, for fluid morphs, I like to stick with Chronos. But you do have the option to use O-Flow if you find that it's giving you better results. So once we select our morph type, we'll go over to the Chronos tab, and here you want to set your frame range. So you want to set your frame range for the length of your actual plate, not the length of your comp, because usually when you're doing jump cuts, the client is going to give you a bunch of extra frames because you're going to need them since you are cutting out frames. So our project might only be set to 150 frames, but this plate that we have here is set to 224 frames, and that's the frame range that we want to use for our fluid morph. So let's just set this. The first frame is 1 and the second frame is 224. So we have that. And now we have some of the same settings that you'll see inside of the Chronos in the O-Flow node itself, which are the settings that we're going to be using for this fluid morph. We'll start with the default settings, and if we need to adjust this, if we find that we have ghosting or some artifacting or anything that needs to be cleaned up, we'll try to adjust the vector detail, and if necessary, the strength. I usually find that I'm only adjusting the vector detail, but there are rare instances where you would need to adjust all of these settings. So first, let's just take a look at our fluid morph with just the settings that we adjusted, the default settings. So all we did so far was we keyframed our morph and then we input the frame range for our plate. And let's watch this play. And now we'll see that smiling movement that the actress was doing and blinking her eye and moving her head. We cut that out. So let's see. It looks like our fluid morph is actually, did we set both keyframes? We set our 0 and we set our 1. Okay, so let's play this again. And now let's look at our before so we can see how it looked before and then after the fluid morph. So we see we cut out some of this movement. Let's take a look at this frame. So yeah, she was moving her body a lot more. Now I want to play this. Actually, we'll just stick to the frames of our morph so we can just start paying attention to how these frames are looking. Actually, I'll change this to in and out. Okay, so let's look. So usually when you're doing these fluid morphs, this actress is just smiling, but more than likely your actors and actresses will be talking. So one thing I like to do, once I set my morph, I like to go in, zoom in a little bit, change my frame rate to 8, and then I like to start watching this play down so that I can see if there's any ghosting happening with her eyes, with her mouth. We see here actually we have some ghosting, I think, in her teeth. So we have some ghosting here that we're not going to be able, like we can't use this ghosting. So we might go in and start adjusting other settings, but we'll see. It's better to play this down slowly and start looking for that ghosting. So let's see. So we know right now we have some ghosting in her mouth. Now let's look at what else we might have. And the other thing with fluid morphs, you really have to watch every part of your plate. We might look, and if I didn't have that ghosting, I might think, oh, this is working pretty well. But you actually have to look at the background. You have to look at how your fluid morph is affecting images or objects, I should say, in the foreground. And then you want to watch the face, but you also need to watch the entire body. So it's pretty tricky because sometimes the fluid morph might work perfectly fine for our actress here, but it might not work at all for our background. And that's when we have to start getting into some other types of compositing tricks to, in a way, rebuild our fluid morph. So let's look at this. So I like to zoom in and then I like to zoom out and watch it slowly as well. So we'll just keep zooming in so I could see what's happening with her body. Pretty often the actress will be breathing and then their chest will move up and down real suddenly because you added this morph, and the client will want you to smooth that out. So let's see if we have that problem here. I think I might show you guys what I would do in the instance that is happening. I think for this morph, it might be fine the way that the rest of her body is moving, even though we have that ghosting in her teeth. It doesn't really look like we have any ghosting anywhere else. And of course, the places that have the most movement are also the places that are more likely to have this ghosting because the changes are so drastic. She's smiling, her teeth are moving in different positions. So that is likely to cause ghosting. If she was moving her hands or waving or something, there would also probably be ghosting around her hands. And let's look at the rest of the shot. I think this camera was still for this shot, so we probably are okay with the rest of our foreground and background elements outside of her. So now that we watched a little bit of her body, let's spread this out so we can just see how it's flowing all together. We'll look at all the frames and we'll see how they're flowing. So I'm specifically looking at her chest to see how her breathing is behaving and then making sure the movement seems natural. And I think for cutting out 50 frames, this is looking pretty good. So let's try to get into how we're going to handle this ghosting in her teeth. The first thing that I would do is just increase my vector detail. So I'll just bring this all the way up, maybe to 0.75. And now I'll watch it and see if that helps. And then if that doesn't help, we'll have to try the next step. So let's watch this play back. That vector detail might be all that we need to get that ghosting out of her teeth. And is it working? I feel like no. I think we still have a few frames of ghosting. It's hard to tell, but I think there was a few frames where we had some ghosting here at the bottom of her teeth. And this is when things start getting tricky, when you have to start singling out certain areas and trying to figure out how to resolve those areas specifically. You get into some tricks. You have to, let's see, we'll zoom all the way in. Actually, I think adjusting the vector detail did clean up most of the ghosting, but we have a little bit. I think here we have something weird happening with her teeth. So let's bring this vector detail up to 1 and see if that helps. And we'll stay on this frame. As you see, if you guys didn't notice, so by default, this was set to 0.3. And we see all of this ghosting all over her mouth. And the higher that we increase it, the more detail we get back. So that actually looks pretty good. Let's see if we want to bring our strength up. Will that help us in any way? So if we bring the strength up, it's also, the strength is now introducing a little bit of artifacting. So we won't adjust that. For now, we will stick to, our vector detail strength at 1. And I think I'm going to go ahead and turn on my region of interest since we know what our problem area is. We don't need to load up every single, we can just load up the areas that we need. We don't need to load everything all the time because we're going to be trying to see how we can get rid of this. So let's see, was that the only frame? Now I'll just turn my in and out points. I will change them to be the exact length of my morph because now I just really want to pay attention to this more. So we have some good detail now in her teeth. Yeah, I think we might have done a good job with her teeth now, actually, just by increasing that vector detail. But I do want to show you guys some ways. Let's say everything else was working for this shot, but her teeth and her face and her teeth were not working. So one thing you can do an overall adjustment. So I'll just save this. I'm actually going to copy this and make a new one. So one thing you can do is spread out your morph. So we already have it set we already have a pretty decent frame range here. And you don't want to change your plate too much. So you don't want to get crazy with spreading this out. But let me just show you. Actually, yeah, this one is spread out pretty well. So I want to show you guys if I didn't use, let's say I maybe only used 5 frames for my morph. The easy way that I like to adjust my keyframes is just to go into the dope sheet and then I just move them here so that I don't have to start moving stuff on the timeline specifically. Let's say we'll go with, well, actually, we'll keep it at 88. We want to stick to the 88, actually. But now let's see, we'll just go to 95, I guess. So we just have a few frames. Let's see how the morph behaves with a shorter frame range. And let's look at it all together. So let's watch this play. And we'll actually just play the frames of the morph, we'll change our in and out points so we're not loading too many frames. So let's see if our morph, or how our morph is working with fewer frames. And we can extend this out so we can see how it's working with the plate, how it's flowing with the plate. I think it was looking pretty good. But this is how you have to keep watching it. Now, ideally, you want to only affect your morph to match the edit ref as much as possible. So if you don't need to start with 10 frames, if your actress isn't talking a lot or isn't moving a lot, you could start with 5 frames, depending on the movement from the last frame before your jump cut and then the movement at the start of your jump cut. If they're so drastic, then you'll know that you do need to spread your frames out. So you can start with a smaller frame range and just build it up as you need it. Stretching out the frame range will help the morph behave a little bit smoother. So now that we have this, let's zoom into her face and let's see. So it's looking like even with fewer frames, it looks like it might still be working. Let's increase our frame rate back up to 24 and just watch this again. And although we're not having the specific problem we were able to get a good morph just by adjusting the vector detail. But I do want to show you guys one of the ways that I would go in and start patching stuff up if I needed to. Let's say the client said, oh, the morph looks great, but her chest is moving up too much, or something else weird is happening. The thing that I would do to go about that is I will, after this finished playing, I'll show you guys how we would deal with that. So for now, yeah, we see actually it looks like she's kind of shifting over randomly, like her body movement, the way that she's leaning a little bit to the screen, right? So that's probably too much. And we didn't really have that, or we didn't have that in our first fluid morph because it was spread out a little bit more. So when you're spreading the frames out, it helps those kind of body movements and whatever movement that is happening. It allows time for that transition in movement, so it doesn't seem so sudden, like like, oh, she just jerked a little bit to the right. You don't want it to feel jerky. You kind of want them to feel smooth. So let's watch this one that's spread out a little bit more. And we'll see now that movement is a little bit more fluid. But if we wanted to adjust the movement even more, we could just extend our frames out a little bit more. So we would just go in, and you have to still be sure to watch for the movement of the mouth and how your morph is going to work with the sound of the plate. This one, she's just smiling, but if she was talking, I would definitely have to be more careful with the stretching them out. But also, if we didn't want to stretch them out, so we can actually use this as an example. So I just undid my little stretching of my frames, and now I'll show you. We like her face, but we don't like her chest. So what I would do is I would take this exact same morph, and then basically I'm going to make a specific morph just for her chest area. So we'll just copy that, and we'll just attach that there, and we have this. And now, since I know that I want her, we probably can delete that. Since I know that I want to have her body movement to not be as sudden, I want to kind of slow down that movement. What I'll do is, in this morph that I copied, I will stretch out those pixels. And although you can do this, this can get a little tricky, because now when I'm going to patch this over, as you'll see, I still have to make sure that my patch is fitting in with the original original morph, as far as like the tracking, the information, the movement. So let's see what we have here now. So this is getting pretty, and these are basically all the steps that I take when I'm doing more fluid morphs. I start off, of course you want to match the edit ref first. Once you match your edit ref, you want to watch it. You want to watch all the parts of your plate. You want to make sure there's no ghosting or artifacting being created. If so, you have to paint those out. And then if there's sudden movements or motions or any sort of feeling of jerking, then you want to go in and spread out your keyframes only to the extent where it's acceptable. I just extended these a lot, and that's probably way too much, but I'm just doing it for this example to show you guys how to patch in another part if your morph is if the movement is too sudden and you get that note back, or if you have an area that you just want to patch in. I'm just going to go through the steps of patching that in, but generally these are the steps. I start with a default vector detail, then I increase it if necessary. And then if that's not working, then you have to go in there and start patching stuff in. And I did just notice a little bit of ghosting here. Look at her sleeve ghosting here. I don't know if we had that before. So that would also need to be adjusted. And that might be because I stretched these frames out too much. So let's just pause that. Like I said, I definitely brought these out too much, so I'll leave it a little bit there. And now let's just go through the process. So again, I like her face. I want to change her body movement. So let's just create a roto mat for her body. Actually, maybe I'll just do an invert of her face. We'll just say, okay, we'll just start with this, because you will have to start testing out which, like you will have to start fine tuning your mat to really get it to fit in, as well as match the tracking information. So you can start with whatever shape you want initially, and then as you're watching it play, then you can go in there and start. And then I'll just create a backdrop for this so that things that are happening in my comp are clear in case anyone needs to pick up this script or help me. And then, you know, I could say, oh, you can just go into the purple backdrop of version 1 or whatever. So we'll call this body morph. So we know that we're trying to adjust her body with this one. And then we'll just merge this back on top of our original morph. But I do know that I want the invert of this alpha, because I so I just inverted that because I want to keep everything outside of her face. So let's watch this play, because what happens, let's see, maybe I should, yeah, just turn on so that we don't have to, I'll down res this place so we don't have to hopefully wait as long for it to load. So let's watch what happens. I didn't do anything so far. All I did was create a mat, and I decided that from this fluid morph, let's just spread that out a little bit. From this fluid morph, my body morph, these are the pixels that I want to keep. And now this one is spread out more. This one has keyframes that are spread out a little further than my initial one. And I'm hoping to smooth out her body motion so that it's not so sudden. Although it wasn't that sudden in my last. So we have vector detail, okay. And okay, so let's look at this. Let's see. Let me look at this other morph. What do we have here? So with our initial morph, we didn't have that ghosting on her arm. But let's see, actually. Let's just swap between these two morphs so we can see how different her body's moving. Because we might have some problems. Yeah, we might have a little bit of a problem with, let's see, which one did we do? We did 104. Well, these frames are actually similar. So we did 88 to 104. So we were stretching it out, and we'll stretch it out on both sides actually. Okay, we'll leave this one like way down there. Okay, so let's take a look now. So we want to adjust her chest movement. Let's see how it's looking so far. We just pasted one on top of the other. Let's see. We could have also did the opposite of cutting out her face and adding that on top. But for now, let's watch it and see how it's gonna look. Does it look like her body's moving less, or is it smoother? And we'll go from there. And I guess we'll also go through part of the steps of how you would handle ghosting if you needed to clean it out. Mostly you could use the roto paint node. When you have ghosting, it gets a little more involved because you have to find clean patches of her body, and then you have to roto that over. So usually you do want to try to get the best morph that you can. Let's see where I put my mats. So actually, let's see, does this, yeah. If you can tell, since we added that on top, we have a little bit of a flutter here in her hair for that mat. So I'm not going to get heavy into how we're going to roto this out, but basically you can just paint a clean patch and then roto her arm back over. Or if you didn't want to deal with any of that, you could just simply keep adjusting your fluid morph until you get a good morph that doesn't require much cleanup work, but also has a very smooth flow in the movement of the characters. So those are the steps for working with fluid morphs. And then we have this fluid morph Gizmo. This Gizmo will be uploaded onto Nukepedia. If you guys want, I will also try to upload it onto my Google Drive in the meantime. But this is the fluid morph tool, and that is how we handle fluid morphs.